There's something so pure about the game of basketball. The fundamental simplicity of two round objects, a ball and a hoop. A single objective, the ball through the hoop. And that's where it starts. A hoop on a garage or a barn. A netless hoop on a leaning pole at the playground. It starts as a solitary game. It starts with imagination. The score is tied. The ball goes up to Smith in the corner. 2 seconds on the clock. He sets, shoots, and scores! The origin of the game is as simple as the game itself. It started with a ball and a basket, a peach basket. It began in 1891 at a YMCA training school in Springfield, Massachusetts. Looking for a new recreation to pass away the long winter months, a young instructor named James Naismith suspended some peach baskets from the balcony of a gymnasium. The students were divided into 2 equal teams, and a soccer ball was tossed into play. Out of the resulting chaos, points were scored. When the ball went into the basket, at which point the ladder was brought out, the ball was retrieved, and the game continued. In spite of its awkward beginnings, the recreation quickly gained popularity, and a new game was born. In the small southwestern Ohio community of Middletown, a new YMCA program had been organized that same year. In March of 1893, a new building was opened at 2nd Street, now Manchester and Broadway, complete with a 3-lane bowling alley, a large swimming pool, and a thoroughly equipped gymnasium. It was there that the game of basketball was first introduced to Middletown. Just 2 years later, the local YMCA team won the Miami Valley League tournament. Little could anyone imagine what basketball fame lay ahead for the town. As the new century began, the city of Middletown was faced with several challenges, not the least of which was its overcrowded schools. Middletown now had 3 major industries: tobacco, paper, and steel. The population had reached 10,000 citizens, and there were 1,400 students enrolled in the school system. When the American Rolling Mill Company, ARMCO, began to expand in 1910 with a large mill to the east of town, Middletown began to grow even more rapidly. In October of 1913 came the news that under the tax laws of 1912, school revenue would be drastically lowered, meaning the school year would have to be reduced from 10 months to 7. A month later, a tax increase was passed, and the school system rallied. Plans began to have a new elementary school on Sherman Street, and there was hope that a new high school would be built. By the end of its first decade, the game of basketball had found its way into most high schools throughout the East and Midwest, competing with the more popular games of football and baseball. At Middletown High School, the early basketball teams were coached by a popular young mathematics teacher named William Krickenberger. He coached both the boys and the girls' teams. By 1913, so many students showed an interest in basketball that besides the varsity boys and girls teams and a second boys team, 4 more class teams were organized into a league. On the varsity schedule were teams from Lebanon, Hamilton, Greenville, as well as McGuffey from Oxford and Woodward High School from Cincinnati. Under Coach Crick, a tradition of winning basketball teams at Middletown High School was begun. His 1913 and 1916 girls teams were undefeated champions in southwestern Ohio. In 1917, both boys and girls teams under new coach E.O. Smith went undefeated in 21 games and outscored opponents by 455 points. The girls team, undefeated in 2 years, defeated the Northern Ohio champs to become undisputed state champs. When the boys' team defeated Springfield, they were invited to the state tournament, where they lost to Cambridge. During the next few years, Middletown teams maintained a winning average under a string of adequate coaches. But in 1923, a young man was hired to coach both football and basketball. Elmo Lingrel would become the first legend in Middletown sports. Lingrel had previously coached both sports at Stivers High School in Dayton. He came highly regarded. Also in 1923, Middletown got its new high school, a grand structure on Girard Avenue. It had 55 classrooms, a huge auditorium, and the first gymnasium in the public school system, all built with the finest materials. It was one of the largest schools in the state of Ohio. Elmo Lingrel continued to coach both sports until 1929, when Royner Green was hired as head basketball coach. He would coach the Middletown Middies for 16 seasons, winning 233 games and losing only 77. But as Royner Green was ending his coaching career at Middletown, a new basketball tradition was just beginning. In 1944, the world was at war. The Second World War had begun in 1939, just 20 years after the war to end all wars had ended. The United States had entered the fight in 1941, after the Japanese attacked the U.S. fleet at Pearl Harbor. By 1944, the Allied forces were beginning to turn the tide against Nazi Germany in Europe. British Royal Air Force planes were dropping thousands of tons of bombs on Berlin. The Russians had driven the Nazis out of Poland, Italy had been liberated, and there was talk of an invasion of Nazi-occupied France. In the Pacific, U.S. forces were defeating the Japanese in fierce fighting on several small islands. On the home front, there was hope among Americans that the great conflict would soon be over. In anticipation of that day, a GI Bill of Rights had gone to the Congress for a vote. In Middletown, Ohio, new draftees were leaving regularly as daily life carried on. When the year began, For Whom the Bells Toll was playing at the Paramount Theater. Saps at Sea with Laurel and Hardy was at the Sorg, and the Mickey Mouse Club had moved to the Strand. Brick Bradford, Red Ryder, and Little Orphan Annie were among the most popular newspaper comic strips. On the local sports scene, the Middletown Middies were enjoying another winning basketball season. Middletown fans had become accustomed to the winning teams under Coach Royner Green. In 1930, two new junior high schools were opened, Roosevelt and McKinley. Each school had its own gymnasium, and from the beginning, inter-school tournaments and rivalries began. Coach Green now had a feeder system for his high school squads, and a tradition of winning basketball was in place. The 1943-44 season began with 5 straight wins before a loss to Springfield High. The Green men were then finishing the season with 10 straight wins, taking the league championship for the 6th time in 7 seasons. The Middie team, led by starters Chick Boxwell, Will Smithers, Howard Schuler, Tom Turner, and Paul Lansaw, now entered tournament play and breezed through the districts and regionals to reach the state championship held in Columbus. In the afternoon game, the Middies led an undefeated Martins Ferry team led by All-State center Alex Groza and favored to win. The Middies took charge, though, at the beginning, and they won the game 38-34. In the championship game that evening, they met Toledo Woodward before a capacity crowd of 4,100. Thousands at home listened to radio broadcasts paid for by Armco Steel as the Middies won a thrilling overtime game 50-47.
Hands on the ball, 7 points, over the basket, and he hands on to it. Middletown leading 50-47, and a foul call on Harrison. That's taking the game.
The Middletown Middies were Ohio High School Class A champs for the first time. Middie Magic had begun. As 1945 began, the tide was turning in the Great World Conflict. After the D-Day invasion at Normandy on June 6 of 44, Allied forces pushed east across Europe toward Germany. In the Pacific, American forces took the islands of Iwo Jima, Manila, and Okinawa. By May, the Nazis had surrendered, and the fight was over in Europe. In August, a new terrifying weapon was unleashed on Japan, the atomic bomb. Japan surrendered, and peace was a reality, but the world was changed forever. In Middletown, Ohio, like cities and towns all over America, citizens welcomed home their brave troops and mourned their fallen heroes. But in the spring of 45, before the outcome of the war was known, Middletown had basketball fever again. The Middies were undefeated going into the state championship. Columbus sports writer Harold Harrison picked the Middies to win. Seniors Paul Lansaw, Will Smithers, and Tom Turner were joined by Charles Klickner, Don Bolton, and Omer Blevins, with Sixt, Keller, and Wells and Hanna rounding out the team. Once again, the Middies swept through the district and regional games. Now, due to gas rationing, hundreds of Middletown fans accompanied the team by train to Toledo and the state finals. The two final games were heart-stoppers. In the semifinal match with Canton McKinley, the Middies were behind by 1 point with 1 second left when junior Omar Blevins tossed in the winning basket, taking the team into the championship game on a 43-game winning streak. There they met Bellevue, also undefeated.
And passes it down to Dudley, who tried to shot the left-hand side of those two. 5 seconds left, and they went 2 points ahead, 36 to 34. 3 seconds left in the ball game. Down to Klickner, who tried to shot, but too late. The ball game is over. The Don ended the ball game 36 to 34. Bellevue winning by that last second basket.
The long night train ride back home seemed twice as long. Basketball season was over, and the future was still uncertain. The United States began to slowly rebuild after the disastrous World War had left 400,000 Americans dead and another 500,000 wounded. The country is now a recognized world power with world responsibilities. As the U.S. was urged to keep its atomic power in check, tensions were already mounting with communist Russia. But America was on the move. Airline travel was soaring. A ENIAC computer managed 5,000 steps per second, and the production of babies was booming. Middletown was also on the move, passing over $2 million in bonds for various improvement projects. It was the largest such endeavor in the city's history. In January, the city learned it had been allocated 33 emergency housing units for married veterans to help alleviate critical housing shortages. Veterans were also being helped by returning to the workplace with on-the-job training programs at several local industries. More than 600 had been placed in jobs in just 6 months. In the late fall, Middletown basketball fans were eager to get that 45-46 season underway, knowing that the starting five were all back, and Letterman, Bolton, Blevins, Wells, Keller, and Lansaw would lead the Middies in the opening game against Bill Kaler's Franklin Wildcats. Leading the Middies this year was a new coach, the first since 1929. George Houck was the replacement for Royner Green, who left after 16 years to coach at Cornell. 2,000 fans watched the Middies whip Franklin and start another run at a state championship. Veteran Milton Mitty Wells and Omer Blevins led the scoring in the first few games, but in the 5th game against Greenville, junior Shelby Linville, a transfer student from Kentucky, replaced the injured Don Bolton. He scored 5 points, and Middy fans began to see some promise for next year's squad.
I talked my parents into it. It didn't take much talking. They got dad, my uncle got dad a job up here, so we moved up. We moved on the farm across from the airport out there for the summer. But to go to Middletown High School, Uncle Shelby's going to pay my tuition. But he decided to buy us I think the house was $4,000, 712 Ellesmere, and let Mom pay small payments on it to him without any interest. So that was beautiful. So that's how we got our start in Middletown. And when I walked on, shall I say, campus of the high school, well, nobody knew me. I went out to see Roy Green when I got here. I wanted to meet him. I heard so much about him, and doggone, he left and went to Cornell. So here I'm just losing coaches left and right. So that's when George Houck took the job and come in.
Once again, the Middie team dominated their opponents and entered tournament play unbeaten.
In the regional tourney, the Middies met the only other undefeated Class A team in the state, Hamilton Catholic. In a rough game with 42 fouls called, the Middies prevailed, and it was on to the state finals in Toledo for the third straight year. In the semifinal game, they beat Toledo Woodward, their rival in the 1944 championship, 53-29. That evening, before 7,000 fans, the tired Middie team trailed Akron North for 3 quarters, unable to beat the fast break.
But in the fourth quarter, they rallied behind Middie Wells' hot shooting. At the end, the Middies led 42-37, and the Johnny Minor Trophy was theirs again. Everyone was talking dynasty. Middletown Journal sports editor Paul Day compared the Middie teams to the great Dayton Stivers squads of 1928, 29, and 30. And the sports writers covering the finals named 4 Middies to the All-Ohio Class A team. But what about next year? None of those great players would be returning, and another change awaited the mighty Middies. Although 4 million veterans were taking advantage of GI Bill for housing, business, and education, the U.S. found itself in another war, a Cold War. Meanwhile, change was taking place rapidly in post-war America. Brooklyn Dodgers first baseman Jackie Robinson broke baseball's color barrier, and jet pilot Chuck Yeager broke the sound barrier flying at 700 miles per hour. Changes in communication were taking place in America's living rooms with the popularity of television. In November of 1946, as the start of another basketball season grew closer, Middletonians were enjoying the latest pop records at the music store on Central Avenue and dancing to the music of Harold Shorty Norris's 8-piece orchestra at Moonlight Gardens. Admission was 50 cents and a beer cost 20 cents. In Cincinnati, an organization planned to build a $1.5 million sports arena. It would be called Cincinnati Gardens, and it was soon to be the scene of many memorable Middie basketball games. In Middletown, the Voters League was organizing a new progress program with 14 points for community improvements in parks, fire protection, streets, and much more. Middletown also had a new radio station, WPFB, the initials of founder Paul F. Braden. When the Middies opened the 1946-47 season against traditional rival Franklin, they found themselves with a new coach, the third in the last 3 seasons. His name was Paul Walker. Many doubted this team would see much success. In the newspaper, Paul Day described the current team this way: "The Middies have good size, probably will be weak defensively, and will come up with a questionable offense." He wasn't even sure the Middies would win the opener. But the team did win. It was a low-scoring affair, 22-16, as Franklin tried the stalling tactic. With wins over Dayton Stivers, Roosevelt, Wilbur Wright, and Miamisburg, the rebuilt Middies under the new coach were off to a good start. But when the season was over, they had posted 6 losses, 2 to Hamilton teams. The rebuilding was not finished. As tournament time approached, most fans felt the team had little chance of repeating as state champs. But at a pre-tournament rally, Shelby Linville predicted the Middies would take it all. After the defeat of Xenia 40-18 in the opening game, fans began to believe. In close wins over Northridge, Hamilton Catholic, Hamilton Public, and Roger Bacon, the Middie team, led by Linville and George McChesney, played with a new intensity. Their contributions from Carl Lansall, Bob Asher, Cliff Wisman, and sophomore Bob Grimes. The Middies rolled over East Liverpool in the final game 47-29 before 9,257 fans, then the largest crowd to witness an Ohio tournament game.
There's the jump, taken by Grimes, given out middle of the forecourt to Lansall, who tries a shot long, no good. Lansall gets the rebound himself, gives it over the right of foul triple to Bush, who tries a shot short, no good. Benville tips it in. Benville jumping high with one hand, tipping in that rebound shot. Middletown 37, East Liverpool 24, 4 minutes, 44 seconds left.
I think the write-up was East Liverpool heavy favorites, so in the state championship, when we blew them off the court. I think we had them down 29-5 and started the game early first half. And he took us out with a 30-point lead, and I think the final 19-point victory was our second team was playing probably the last 6 minutes of the game or so, and they kept their first team in, and that made the difference there.
On March 24, the team was welcomed home with a huge parade and celebrations at the high school gym. Middletown could now rightfully call itself the basketball capital of Ohio, with 3 state championship titles in 4 years under 3 different coaches. And what about next year? With only one senior, Carl Lansall, leaving, the Middies seemed ready to continue their reign. Although inflation was rising rapidly, the country's post-war boom continued. New products and services introduced in 1948 would change the lifestyle of Americans and the world. In a New Jersey lab, the transistor was invented, revolutionizing the world of electronics. And in San Bernardino, California, Richard and Maurice McDonald opened a hamburger drive-in. Their sign said, "Buy 'em by the bag." Tensions in Europe and Southeast Asia prompted President Harry Truman to reinstate a peacetime military draft. Like most Americans, Middletown citizens continued to worry that another world war was possible. But to calm these fears, there was television, with a host of new shows: Candid Camera, The Milton Berle Show, Toast of the Town with Ed Sullivan, and Studio One. And in Middletown, there was always basketball. All-state senior Shelby Linville and junior Bob Grimes led the Middies through 18 straight victories, 2 over rival Hamilton. George McChesney and Bob Bush had improved as the season progressed, and at tournament time the number 1 ranked Middies seemed invincible. After beating Hamilton for the 3rd time on a technical foul shot by Linville, the Middies moved on through 2 more games to meet Miamisburg. In a scrimmage game the week before, the Middies had trounced that same team by 40 points. But on this night, the magic didn't work.
Miamisburg upset the highly favored Middies, and the community was reminded of the fragile nature of competitive team sports.
While Americans were preoccupied with the latest fads, roller derbies, Pillsbury bake-offs, flying saucers, big-time wrestling, silly putty, and Captain Video, the Soviet Union blasted the world balance of power by detonating a nuclear device. The Russians had the bomb, and the arms race was on. A noted senator understated, "This is now a different world." A month later, in October, the cornerstone of the United Nations building was laid in New York City, amidst hopes that this world peacekeeping organization would succeed in its mission. Middletown now had a new bridge over the Great Miami River and a new form of government with a 5-member city commission and city manager Herb Sterick. Still reeling from last season's upset by Miamisburg, fans were cautiously optimistic about Coach Paul Walker's 48-49 squad. The small but balanced team featured seniors Bob Grimes, Merle Hetfield, and Cliff Wisman, juniors Jesse Mayab and Dick Coddington. After a solid start, disaster struck in the 8th game against Monroe when leading scorer Merle Hetfield was injured. The Middies won the game, but when they met Hamilton at the Xavier Fieldhouse in Cincinnati, they were outmatched by the powerful Big Blue team 40-25. 6 games later, they met Hamilton again, held their own until foul trouble led to a 49-42 loss. The Middies rallied to end the season strong and went on to win the district tournament. In the regionals, the Middies met Hamilton again. And again, it's the Big Blue team that prevailed, led by star Bill Wilkes, Jim Bailey, and Bernie Griesinger. It was Hamilton's turn for a state title. Middletown would have to wait.
The 50s were a phenomenal time. We'll never see them again. There was a certain aura in the town that didn't exist in other communities in America. It was very, very special. Following World War II, there were plenty of jobs for people. It was prosperous. Children could stay out late at night playing kick the can well after dark because their parents weren't concerned that somebody was going to do something to them. It was a wonderful way of life, and people were not locked in their homes watching television like they are today, because television was not anything at all, and there wasn't air conditioning, and so people were out. People knew each other. It was friendly. It was great. It was a great time to live and a great time to grow up.
Much has been written about America in the 1950s. It's been called both a decade of innocence and a mean time, one long pajama party, and an age of anxiety. To be sure, it was a time of contrasts. Having survived a decade of economic depression, followed by a decade of World War, older Americans were looking to settle down and return to sanity. But the country was booming with new prosperity. America was on the go, and cultures were racing on a collision course that would result in an explosion called the 1960s. The decade began with another war, called only a police action. Following an attack by the North Korean forces on South Korea, the U.S. committed naval, air, and ground forces to an effort to contain the spread of communism in Southeast Asia. America would now face its first military test after emerging as a world power after World War II. In the heartland of the Midwest, Middletown, Ohio, was enjoying this new time of good living. In July of 1950, the community's largest corporate citizen, Armco Steel, celebrated its 50th anniversary by throwing a huge picnic at Sunset Park. Top executives handed out thousands of hot dogs, and crowds were treated to the biggest new American sports phenomenon, wrestling, and its biggest star, Gorgeous George. In many places, the game of basketball was still a simple playground game. But in Middletown, Ohio, by 1950, basketball defined the community. During the summer months, there were pickup games on backyard courts all over town and in the parks. Organized game gave fans a chance to see future stars. During the season, meetings were scheduled around home and away games. The season tickets were hard to come by. The 1949-50 season began with veterans Jesse Mayab and Dick Coddington as solid starters. Also on the starting five for the first time were two black players, Eddie Merchant and Bobby Morris. Their regular play that year in some way mirrored the subtle changes taking place in America. President Truman had integrated the Army in 1948, but the separation of the races, though less forced in the North than in the South, was still the norm for most of the country. Despite a hot and cold season, the Middies once again won the district championship, but lost to state champion Springfield in the regionals. In Korea, a truce seemed closer. While at home, Sugar Ray Robinson whipped Jake LaMotta for the middleweight boxing title. Senator Estes Kefauver's Senate hearings were beating down organized crime. Lucy and Desi began their weekly hysterics on I Love Lucy, and the U.S. released a thermonuclear explosion called the H-bomb. Suddenly, the latest science fiction movie thriller, The Day the Earth Stood Still, didn't seem so fictional. Results of the 1951 census showed Middletown now with a population of 33,695 citizens. Directly related to the increased tensions of the Cold War, a civilian defense program was organized with retired Armco executive W.J. Beck as director. Hopes were high as the basketball season opened, After 10 straight wins, the Middies fell to cross-county rival Hamilton, and the team never seemed to regain its momentum. Stars Eddie Merchant and Bobby Morris were joined by juniors Dick Weiss and Don Barnett, and a tall sophomore named Cliff Hafer. In the district tournament against Dayton Stivers, the Middies went cold, and it was all over for another season. After 3 years without a trip to the state finals, Middletonians were wondering if the magic had ended for good. The big news of 1952 was the presidential race between former World War II Supreme Allied Commander General Dwight D. Eisenhower and Illinois Governor Adlai Stevenson. The Democrats had been in the White House for 2 decades, but the country liked Ike, and now it was the Republicans' turn. Eisenhower vowed to go to Korea to see firsthand what it would take to end the conflict. While the threat of communism in government was kept alive by GOP Senator Joe McCarthy, most Americans ignored his rantings and continued to enjoy increasing prosperity. Many adults were now investing in the stock market. Children dreamed of owning a new Schwinn bicycle with white walls and tasseled handlebars, and teenagers were souping up their hot rod cars. In Helsinki, Finland, the U.S. Olympic team was breaking records on their way to a victory over the Soviet Union, while at home, a record of dubious distinction was broken. In a report from the Tuskegee Institute, 1952 was the first year since records were first kept in 1881, that no racially motivated lynchings of blacks were reported. Civil rights for all Americans was an issue slowly gaining momentum. In Middletown, plans were made for a new Catholic high school named Bishop Fenwick, and over $2 million was raised for an expansion to the hospital. In September, General Eisenhower made a campaign stop in Middletown on his way to the U.S. presidency. As the Middies began preseason basketball practice, Coach Paul Walker was optimistic about the success of this team. Although he had lost All-State nominee Eddie Merchant and solid players Don Oglesby and Charles McChesney and Bobby Morris, returning seniors and co-captains Dick Weiss and Don Barnett would provide leadership to a young but talented squad. Rounding out the starting 5 would be juniors Cliff Hafer, Tom Dillman, and sophomore Owen Lawson, sent up by junior high varsity coach Tiger Ellison to fill the missing guard position.
Well, you had a designated role. Let me give you an example. The 1952 team, and I have to talk about the team I was on. You had 2 seniors, 2 juniors, and a sophomore. Owen Lawson was a sophomore, and as I said earlier, Owen was told to take the ball out of bounds and give it to Dick Weiss or me. And that was his role. Dick Weiss was a shooter. I was a playmaker, defensive player. Hafer was a post player, and Dillman on the other side. Scrappy, get the ball off the board.
But this team had depth. Juniors Ralph Phibbs, Ed Skeeter Payne, and Paul Johnson were regular substitutes throughout the season. Sophomores Eric Back, Ron Stokely, and Leonard Johnson rounded out this talented team. All of these players had come through the solid junior high system, coached by either Ralph Reddick at Roosevelt or Deacon Deal at McKinley. When their turn came to play varsity basketball, they were prepared.
When you play on the McKinley team or the Roosevelt team, those are 2 junior high schools, if you played on one of those teams, you stood a better than average chance of making the Middletown High School team. Coach Walker would be looking at you, and his scouts would come up and tell him and so forth. So when you got to Middletown High, in the 10th grade, you were pretty well destined to be on the team if all went well academically and so forth. But you still had to try out and make the team.
And Paul Walker was always prepared to take the best qualities of his players in developing a new team each season. With this season came a new run-and-shoot style of play. Gone was the slow, deliberate style of teams called the Refrigerator 5. Much like the current lifestyle of the country, basketball was now a game of go, go, go. And go this team did, ripping through 17 opponents in the regular season, losing only to rival Hamilton. In the district and regional tournaments, the Middies outscored opponents by a total of 100 points. Once again, the Middies were in the state championships. After easy victories over Cleveland, St. Ignatius, and Withrow, the team faced Steubenville, ranked number 1 in the state.
56-41, the Middies are in the lead. Looks like they're going to try and freeze it now and hang on. Barnett throws into the circle to Johnson. Johnson off to Eddie Payne. Eddie Payne in for the layup. It's good! 58-41. Eddie Payne played some sparkling ball last night. He's back in here picking up again tonight.
Led by senior stars Weiss and Barnett, the Middies were victorious, and for the 4th time, they were state champs. Middie Magic had returned.
When the moon hits your eye like a big pizza pie, that's amore.
The Korean War was finally over, but a fragile peace remained. North and South Korea were still divided along the 39th parallel. Containing the spread of communism in Asia had limited results, but a costly price. Over 55,000 Americans were dead and over 100,000 wounded. Citizens were confused by this new style of warfare and hoped it would be their last look at war. The world had a new look from its highest peak, as Great Britain's Edmund Hillary and Nepalese guide Tazing Norgay became the first humans to scale 25,000-foot Mount Everest in the Himalayas. The new look at the movies was in 3 dimensions. 3D glasses made images appear to come right off the screen. Middletown's first 3D movie, The House of Wax, starring Vincent Price, premiered in June at the Paramount Theater on Broad Street. In 1952, Coach Paul Walker's new run-and-shoot offense had led to another state basketball championship. And in 1953, he had most of his runners and shooters back. At home, they would play in a new home, Wadey Miller Gym, named for Middletown's longtime superintendent and biggest fan. In the first game, over 3,000 fans watched as the Middies defeated Miamisburg 84-57. No less than 13 players were in the scoring column when the final buzzer sounded. Opposing coaches took notice.
And, of course, we were in the new gym at that time. We started the new gym in 52. December 5th, we played Miamisburg and beat them handily. And we had the old gym for the Saturday morning leagues.
The high-scoring 1953 Middies won their first 10 games, regularly scoring 70, 80, 90 points. But then came traditional county rival Hamilton and a loss by 3 points. The team closed out the season with only one more loss to Portsmouth and entered the district tournament as a strong favorite to win. And win they did. Moving on to the regionals at Cincinnati Gardens, familiar turf for the Middies. After wins against St. Xavier, Tecumseh, and Cleveland St. Ignatius, they faced Newark in the state finals. Their 38-point margin of victory was the largest to date, and Middletown had its 5th state championship and also a new state record.
A lot of great kids on this Middletown squad, kids that seem to find their way into your heart and really make you play that game right with them. They've been a grand bunch of boys, starting back about 3 years ago, and it's awfully hard to not get attached to them.
Middletown Journal sports editor Jerry Nardiello posed this question: what is Middie Magic? Superintendent Wadey Miller described it as long hours of hard work, sleepless nights, and foodless days for the coach. Coach Ellison said it began 30 years ago with Coach Elmo Lingrel. It was also described as the sixth man on the floor spirit. Nardiello summed it up. One thing is certain, it has caught on around the state, and the one who originated can stand a pat on the back.
But one day when I was in the 8th grade, back then you walked. If you didn't have a nickel to get on the bus, you walked. So I was walking to the YMCA, and I got down to the corner where Lakeside Inn is. And everybody had lined Titus Avenue. I mean, there must have been thousands of people out there lining Titus Avenue. And the state championship team came in on convertibles. And Shelby was in there, and
and McChesney and all those guys that had played on that 47 championship team. And I knew right then that that's what I wanted to do. I knew then I wanted to be a Middie.
Hey, baby, what do I have to do to make
The biggest national issue in 1954 was still the threat of spreading communism in Eastern Europe, Latin America, and Indochina. President Eisenhower compared the threat to a row of dominoes. You knock over the first one, and the rest will go. Ike promised more help to the struggling country of South Vietnam. At home, Senator McCarthy was now investigating communism in the U.S. Army, with Senate hearings broadcast live on television.
As General Motors neared the production of its 50 millionth car, the White House announced a $5 billion interstate highway system to be developed over the next decade. The president referred to the industrial, scientific, and creative genius of our people.
During 1954, children began receiving the new polio vaccine developed by Dr. Jonas Salk. Over 21,000 individuals, mostly children, had been affected with this disease since 1952. In a landmark civil rights case, named Brown versus Board of Education, the Supreme Court overturned previous decisions permitting the segregation of schools by race. It declared unconstitutional the policy of separate but equal. In sports, a lanky Brit named Roger Bannister became the first to break the 4-minute mile.
Once I had a secret love.
In May, the Middletown High School Prom Jubilee was a 2-day affair, with the prom at the Manchester Hotel, followed by the Saturday morning movie at the Paramount Theater, and topped off with a late-night caravan to Lesourceville Lake Amusement Park, where there was dancing to the Ray Anthony Orchestra. More than 500 students participated that year. Owen Lawson and Sally O'Friel were crowned King and Queen. As the basketball season got underway, Coach Paul Walker had a problem. Even with starting guards All-State Owen Lawson and Eric Back returning, Walker had lost much of the depth of his previous championship teams. Even so, the Middies posted 18 wins and only 2 losses as it entered the postseason tourneys. In the 4th game of the district against Roosevelt, who had beaten them in the regular season, the Middies fell behind and played catch-up for most of the game. In the end, it was Roosevelt 64, Middletown 62. Dreams of 3 championships in a row were over, but hopes for the future were high. Sophomore Ron Dykes would be returning. Roosevelt Junior High team went undefeated on the play of Bob Cole and Bob Reed, Jay Bird, and a tall 8th grader named Jerry Lucas. In January, President Eisenhower became the first president to conduct a televised news conference. Americans could now get their news firsthand right in their living rooms, and news was happening fast. In February, the president sent a small force of military advisors to South Vietnam to assist their armed forces. The Supreme Court announced directories for school integration. The minimum wage was increased to $1 an hour. In the world of entertainment, Marilyn Monroe was the top box office draw. Walt Disney opened a new theme park in California, and Rock Around the Clock was #1 on the music charts. Rock and roll was here to stay, much to the concern of most adults. As the year ended, a seemingly unremarkable event took place in Montgomery, Alabama, when a 45-year-old department store worker boarded a bus, paid her dime fare, and sat down dead tired after a long day at work. As the bus filled, the black woman was asked to move to the back to give the white passengers seats in the front. Rosa Parks refused, was arrested, and the civil rights movement had its first unlikely hero. By 1955, the $2.7 million expansion program at Middletown Hospital was now complete, bringing the patient capacity to nearly 300 beds. Responding to an increase in patients with heart problems, the hospital now had an EKG machine, the most modern cardiac technology available. Every sports team has what it called a building season. The 1954-55 Middie basketball season was just that. There were several young players with great potential, but the team's inexperience led to a 16-8 season. By tournament time, the team had gained maturity and won the district before losing an overtime battle with Hughes 72-71. Though disappointed, Middie fans could see what was coming next year. The Cold War heated up when Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev declared to Western countries, "We will bury you." The atomic clock ticks faster and faster, said Robert Oppenheimer, head of the Manhattan Project, that developed the first atomic bomb over a decade before. But most Americans went on with their lives, enjoying the prosperity of the 1950s. Families gathered around the television to watch the latest quiz shows, or enjoyed movies together at a drive-in theater. Teenage girls were going ape over a hip-swinging singer from Memphis, Tennessee, named Elvis. And going steady meant wearing each other's class ring on a chain around the neck for all to see. In November, Ike was re-elected to the White House, and the Supreme Court ruled segregation on buses was unconstitutional. The Reverend Martin Luther King Jr. declared nonviolence is the most potent technique for oppressed people. In Middletown, voters approved a $6.5 million expansion and improvement program designed to bring all existing schools up to a high standard for the nearly 15,000 Middletown area students. In the opening game of the 1955-56 season against Dayton Dunbar, Middletown got a preview of what was to come that entire season. A running offense led by guard Jay Bird, shot making by co-captains Bob Cole and Ron Dykes, and solid rebounding by 6'8" sophomore center Jerry Lucas. In the first two games, the Middies scored a total of 190 points, almost double that of their opponents. It was thrilling to watch, but would these good players work together as a great team?
A basketball team, I think, is like a car that runs well. You know, everything meshes, the gears work, the transmissions work, the transmission works well, it's got enough gas in it to keep it going, and it's got enough fuel, which is preparation and hard work, and all those things, go into making a great team. And Paul knew how to make those parts work and mesh and do what they should.
As they continued to dominate teams throughout the season, the answer became clear and Middie fans began to feel the old magic again. When Skeeter Wallace was moved to fill the other forward positions, the starting five was set. Years later, most fans would agree that it was the best starting five in Middie history.
Jerry Lucas was phenomenal. Everybody knows how he was, but he had so much talent with him coming in that they knew. I mean, everybody expected it from day one before the season even started that they were going to win the state. Dykes could score 20 points in any game. So could Skeeter Wallace. Of course, Bob Cole. I mean, he had one game against, I think it was Columbus East. I think he had like 30-some points at halftime, maybe 30 at halftime.
The bench was seeing a lot of action also, as the Middies led most games by 20 to 30 points at the beginning of the fourth quarter. As the district tournament began, the Middies were ranked number 1 in the state after posting a 17-0 record for the season. The team sailed through the 4 district games, and in the regionals, they mounted wins of 102 to 82 over Portsmouth and 98 to 65 over Hughes. Few fans across the state doubted that the Middies would win another state championship after dominating their opponents throughout the year. and win they did with impressive victories over Cleveland East Tech and Canton McKinley in the final game. The team was now called the Magnificent Middies.
So it's number 4 for Coach Paul Walker, so they've walked off with just about every honor in the state of Ohio. Lucas Player of the Year, Walker Coach of the Year, Walker 4 championships now. The Middies have 6. Boys, a happy bunch of boys across the way ready to bust loose. And McKinley gets it, 5 seconds to go in the ball game. Here's McKinley down the floor, running shot up there is no good by McIntyre. The final score, Middletown 91, Canton McKinley 69.
In August of 1957, the Congress of the United States passed the Civil Rights Act over the objection of lawmakers from the southern states. The act was evidence that the federal government at last was making efforts to guarantee full rights for all citizens, regardless of color. A month later, that effort was put to the test in Arkansas, as the integration of Little Rock High School was achieved, but only with help of 1,000 paratroopers and 10,000 Arkansas National Guard troops. They were ordered into service by President Eisenhower to control angry mobs. He stated, "Mob rule cannot be allowed to override the decisions of our courts." While parts of the country struggled to right old wrongs, new strides in technology were showcasing American ingenuity and imagination. In March, a Boeing 707 airliner with 42 passengers flew nonstop across the country in 3 hours 48 minutes, a new record. In Pennsylvania, atomic energy was now used to power electricity. But on October 4th, the nation was stunned when the Soviet Union successfully launched the first satellite into space, called Sputnik. The small orb sent signals back to Earth as it orbited the planet. American efforts to launch a similar satellite had failed consistently, and a full effort was mounted to catch up. The space race had begun. Middletown youth would now benefit from a new building program organized by the Civic Association. The plan called for the improvement of all facilities serving the youth of the community. Expectations were higher than ever before as the basketball season approached. Jerry Lucas's sophomore year had been sensational, and it was expected that this year would be even better. Scrappy guard Jay Bird and high-scoring Bob Cole were also back. But a new Ohio High School Athletic Association ruling made the 19-year-old Cole ineligible. Coach Paul Walker's starting 5 would now include Larry Emmerich, Bob Reed, and Tom Sizer, all of whom had seen lots of action the year before. The Middies picked up right where they left off in 1956 with impressive victories over their first 10 opponents. After a tough overtime win over Columbus East, the team finished the season with 7 more victories and a second undefeated season. In the district and regional tournaments, the Middies rolled over teams before meeting Toledo Macomber in the state semifinal game, one which Middie fans would remember for years as the most exciting game in school history. With only a minute and 19 seconds left, Middletown was behind by 7 points.
And it is 61-59. The Middies putting it in play to Sizer. Sizer up the floor to Emmerich, and it's out of bounds. It's out of bounds there against the Middies, against Macomber. Lucas shoots. Good! It's going to be an overtime, I believe. Hold on. I believe it's going to be an overtime. It is an overtime. The bucket by Lucas counts. Coach Paul Walker completely collapsed on the floor with 1 second to go. Lucas pumped it in behind the circle.
A 25-foot jumper by Jerry Lucas just before the buzzer sent the game into overtime, and the charged-up Middies took control and won 70-65. The next night, the Middies displayed their magic again with a win over Kent Roosevelt for an unprecedented 7th state championship. Times were never better in Middletown. Community pride and civic achievement were at all-time high. Business was booming, and for basketball fans, the news was even better. Jerry Lucas had 1 more year in high school. The 1950s was a time for fads and crazes, and in 1958 came the biggest craze of them all in the form of a plastic hoop, swiveled around the hips of millions of delighted kids and frustrated adults. It was called the hula hoop. Meanwhile, the most popular hip swiveler on the music scene, Elvis Presley, was off to the Army. And in his place were rockers called Little Richard, Chuck Berry, and young stars Buddy Holly, Ritchie Valens, and the Big Bopper.
Hello, baby.
While much was being written about America's growing materialistic society, the American Express Company introduced a new way to purchase goods with a small piece of plastic called a credit card. 500,000 were in use by the end of the year. For America's younger population, debt was nothing to be feared. If you wanted to keep up with the Joneses, just charge it. Capping off a decade of unparalleled growth and achievement, in January 1958, Middletown was voted an All-American City by the National Municipal League and Look magazine, one of only 11 cities nationwide. Once again, the Middletown Middies began a basketball season ranked number 1 in the state of Ohio. Starting with a 56-game winning streak, 2 straight championships, and Jerry Lucas, Larry Emmerich, and Tom Sizer returning, the Middies seemed unstoppable. Unstoppable they were, scoring an average of 80 points a game through the first 11 games. Then came the big game everyone had been anticipating, a showdown between the Middies, ranked number 1, and Hamilton Big Blue, ranked number 2. 13,649 fans at Cincinnati Gardens watched a close-fought game until the Middies dominated the fourth quarter and won 64-49. 5 more wins, and the Middies closed out the season with a win over Portsmouth Trojans. Jerry Lucas scored 37 points to raise his total to over 2,250, breaking the high school scoring record of Wilt Chamberlain. The Middies had a record 3 straight unbeaten seasons heading into the tournament play, and were looking for an 8th state championship. In the district, 3 Dayton teams, Dunbar, Chaminade, and Roosevelt, proved no match as the Middies moved on to Hamilton. In another thriller, Middletown edged out Hamilton 66-62.
Oh, baby, that's what I like!
After 2 wins in the regionals, the Middies faced the Polar Bears of Columbus North on March 21, 1958. At the end of 3 quarters, the Middies were ahead 48-43, but North gradually took control and led 59-56 with 1 minute and 7 seconds left.
6 to go in the ball game. Here's Payne down cross center. Payne back in the circle to Lucas. Lucas on the left side to Roberts. Back into Lucas, lays it up. It is in. 61-58. 54 seconds to go in the ball game. Up the floor to Downey. Downey comes in, left of the circle. 3-point lead for Columbus North. 47 seconds to go. There's a pass off to Wary. Sizer intercepts. Here's Sizer going in. The layup good. And it is 61-60. The Middies trail by 1. Here's Columbus North putting the ball in play as it is a foul on the toss in. A foul called on the play. He pumps it up. It's no good. And the rebound is tied up. Here's the tip. It is batted up the floor. Goes to Columbus North. Payne intercepts. Payne intercepts for the Middies. Gives there to Lucas. Lucas off to Payne. Payne on the left of the circle. The ball batted away. Payne gets it back. He shoots it up. No good. There's a whistle on the play. George Payne at the line. He shoots. It's no good. And the tip goes to Columbus North. Wary trying to get away there. And he is tied up. He is tied up. Tied up on the play. Here's the tip taken by Sizer, and he's bumped on the play by Ed Clark. Tom Sizer will be at the line. He pumps it up. It's good. Second one. Good. Columbus North throwing the ball down the floor. It's batted out of bounds by Jerry Lucas. A tremendous effort. They have the ball, though. Here's Wary. Throws underneath there to Clark. Lays it up and in. Columbus North has upset the Middletown Middies.
Many a tear has to fall, but it's all in the game.
Columbus North had accomplished what no other team had in 76 games. The Middies had been beaten, and an era in Ohio high school basketball had come to an end. In the world of sports, there are those times when the stars align perfectly to form championship teams. Perfect seasons with perfect players and perfect coaches. College and professional basketball great Bill Bradley has written, "Teammates on a team that wins will never be strangers. Teammates on a team that wins a state championship will be forever bound by their mutual achievement. Championship teams share a moment that few other people know." For high school championship teams, the achievement occurs at a moment in life when time stands still. Frozen between childhood and adulthood, the teenage athlete knows only the immediate, the moment of glory, a moment unmatched by any other before or after. Another basketball legend, Bill Russell, said, "It's easier to become number one than to stay number one." From 1943 to 1958, the Middletown Middies dominated high school basketball in Ohio, winning 7 state basketball titles, a record that still stands.
And we were the big news. So the whole area was up on Middletown, especially in basketball. So we had a reign at least from 42 through 59, a 17-year reign like no other high school has ever had in this country.
You played on a team. All the guys wanted to win, had the desire to win, and all they wanted to do was just be able to say, "I'm on the Middie team and I will do whatever it takes." Nothing like a champion. Nothing like a champion.
Every kid in Middletown wanted to be a Middie. It was just a phenomenal era.
It was very important for everybody on a team to feel that they were contributing and part of that team. It wasn't just one person or 2 people. It was a group of 12 players who were a whole and did something special and unique. And that certainly happened in Middletown. So we had a great deal of fun and a great camaraderie. You know, I mean, it was wonderful being a Middletown Middie. It was wonderful for the whole city of Middletown to enjoy the success of the Middies and talk about it and have fun with it. And it was a tremendous, tremendous time in my life.
Reflection on that magical time reveals more than just memories of star players and exciting games, more than inspiring coaches and city pride. It's no coincidence that the achievements of Middletown High School basketball teams occurred at a unique time in U.S. history. America was now defined by a sense of optimism and confidence, born out of a total victory in World War II. By 1950, the middle class was in full pursuit of the American dream. For most citizens, it was a time of good living, fueled by an increase in personal income and education and leisure time. Realizing the American dream created a national consumption of goods and products thought necessary for the good life. Post-war America was a time of recovery. For years, world events had dominated daily life. But now, both returning war veterans and those on the home front search for a life of stability, security, and community. For the community of Middletown, Ohio, the game of basketball provided an inward focus on optimism, what coaches call a winning attitude. As each season ended, the community rallied in anticipation of the next with a renewed faith in the future. The brief decade and a half from 1943 to 1958 was a time of unprecedented progress and pride for the city of Middletown, and at the core was a spirit born out of a simple game, a spirit called Middie Magic.
time, sugar time, sugar time.